Hello, my name is Emma Hunt, and this is my thesis, The Legitimacy-Access Paradox, Humanitarian Discourse and the Reclassification of Non-State Armed Actors in Fragile and Post-Conflict States. I want to begin not with a case, but with a structural observation, one that existing scholarship has not adequately named. International actors depend on local organizations for access, contextual knowledge, and community credibility. Yet engaging those same actors can constitute political legitimacy, whether or not that outcome is intended. This is the tension at the heart of contemporary crisis response. Humanitarian agencies, UN bodies, and diplomatic actors all face this challenge. You cannot reach populations in need without coordinating with whoever controls the territory, but coordination requires language, and language does things. Operational terms like local partner, de facto authority, and stabilizing actor are not neutral descriptions. They are performative categories, terms that position actors within frameworks of legitimacy. And this can occur before elections, moderation, or verified governance reform. I call this the Legitimacy-Access Paradox, the structural tension between the need to engage local authorities for operational purposes and the political effects that engagement produces. The language required to gain access can constitute the legitimacy it claims to merely describe. Existing literatures approach this terrain, but none of them fully capture what I'm describing. Armed group transformation studies assume that legitimacy follows behavioral change, that actors must earn recognition through negotiated settlements, renunciation of violence, and electoral participation. Humanitarian access literature treats coordination language as purely operational, necessary for logistics but politically inert. Recognition theory focuses on formal diplomatic acts, who recognizes whom and when, but not the discursive groundwork that makes recognition intelligible in the first place. And even constructivism, which takes discourse seriously, typically assumes that language responds to material transformation rather than producing it. What these literatures share is an assumption that legitimacy follows transformation. They treat humanitarian language as neutral, not constitutive. And they examine formal recognition, the moment of acknowledgement, rather than the discursive conditions that make that moment possible. This thesis addresses that gap. The problem stated plainly, institutional discourse can precede, enable, and sometimes produce political legitimacy before any verified behavioral change. To make sense of this, I draw on three theoretical traditions. Constructivism tells us that institutional categories don't just reflect social reality, they create it. How actors are described shapes what they can become within the system. Speech Act theory shows that authorized language performs actions. Naming an actor as a de facto authority doesn't just describe a status. Under the right conditions, it enacts one within a specific domain. And recognition theory reminds us that political standing depends on being acknowledged by legitimate institutions. Recognition begins with categorization, the act that makes an actor visible and intelligible within the international system. The mechanism is iterative and it unfolds in 5 steps. 1. Operational necessity forces engagement. 2. Institutions adopt functional categories to justify coordination. 3. These categories perform limited recognition. 4. Repetition normalizes the actor as a governance partner. 5. When circumstances shift, political authority becomes assignable, not because of transformation, but because the discursive groundwork was already laid. This is how the paradox operates, and Syria offers an unusually clear environment to observe it. Before I trace the discursive evolution, let me situate the case. Syria's civil war began in 2011. Over the following decade, state authority fragmented across armed actors and territorial control became deeply contested. Shortly after, Abu Muhammad al-Jawlani, a member of al-Qaeda since 2003, founded and led Jabhat al-Nusra, al-Qaeda's official Syrian affiliate. He was listed under the UN Security Council's ISIL and al-Qaeda sanctions regime. In 2017, al-Jawlani rebranded. He severed formal ties with al-Qaeda and formed Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS. He also established the Syrian Salvation Government, an 11-ministry administrative structure governing approximately 4 million people in Idlib in northwest Syria. Between 2017 and 2023, HTS consolidated territorial control, and UN agencies needing access to populations in need began coordinating humanitarian operations through its governance structures. Then, on November 27, 2024, HTS, under al-Jawlani's command, launched Operation Deterrence of Aggression. Aleppo fell, then Hama, then Homs. 11 days later, Damascus fell, and the Assad regime collapsed. On December 8, 2024, the Assad regime collapsed. Al-Jawlani's forces took Damascus. 12 days later, on December 20, 2024, a U.S. delegation arrived in Damascus. It was the first official diplomatic visit to the embassy since it closed in 2012. On that same day, the State Department removed the $10 million bounty on al-Jawlani's head. An Assistant Secretary of State, Barbara Leaf, after meeting with him, described al-Jawlani as pragmatic. On January 29, 2025, al-Jawlani declared himself interim president of Syria. He assumed the office under his civilian name, Ahmed al-Sharaa. July 2025, the United States terminated its Syria sanctions program and removed HTS from the Foreign Terrorist Organization list. On November 5, 2025, the legitimacy was complete. The UN Security Council removed al-Sharaa from the ISIL and al-Qaeda sanctions list. No elections, no negotiations, no verified reform. From sanctions designation to Security Council delisting in under 11 months. That speed is what makes this case theoretically significant, and as I will show you, the discursive groundwork had been laid for nearly a decade. Syria offers a uniquely clear window into the legitimacy-access paradox. After more than a decade of civil war, formal institutions were severely weakened, territorial authority was fragmented, and humanitarian access depended entirely on coordination with whoever controlled the ground. That meant naming was unavoidable. You cannot negotiate convoy access with an actor you refuse to classify, and so the classification began. A decade of UN reporting captures in real time how operational vocabulary reclassified an armed actor before transformation occurred. What makes Syria theoretically significant is this. It demonstrates legitimacy being produced before rather than after transformation. That inversion is the heart of the paradox. And to understand what makes Syria unusual, we need comparison. The FARC in Colombia took 5 years of UN-monitored disarmament, 13,000 weapons surrendered, and reintegration under international oversight. The IRA in Northern Ireland took 11 years of monitored decommissioning under the Good Friday Agreement, verification by independent bodies, institutionalization before full recognition. And the Ennahda in Tunisia, 40 years of ideological evolution, electoral accountability, and multi-party coalition governance. These cases share a common structure. Legitimacy followed verified transformation. Syria does not fit this pattern. Here's the trajectory. 2016 to 2017, early reporting used explicit counterterrorism labels, Al-Qaeda affiliate or terrorist organization, but operational needs introduced softer terms. Non-state armed group appeared. Functional categorization began. 2017 to 2019, de facto authorities entered humanitarian vocabulary, first in coordination documents where access dependency was strongest. 2019 to 2023, normalization through repetition. Humanitarian, diplomatic, and media sources began citing each other. Justificatory drift sedimented the terminology. 2023 to 2024, dual-track discourse became visible. Counterterrorism language persisted in formal venues, but governance-oriented categories dominated operational and political reporting. 2024 to 2025, recognition consolidated. Ahmed al-Sharaa, or al-Jawlani, became internationally recognized as head of state, completing a discursive trajectory a decade in the making. Let me show you how this looked in practice. Early reporting used explicit counterterrorism labels. Operational need for access introduced softer, functional categories. Humanitarian coordination required neutral terms, language that could be used to negotiate convoys and security guarantees. Over time, bureaucratic engagement normalized governance-oriented language. What began as logistical necessity became political common sense. November 2020, OHCHR press briefing on Idlib violations and abuses. The phrase, quote, so-called trials by the de facto authorities, end quote. This is the first pivot from terrorist group to governance terminology with implied responsibilities. The actor is now described as conducting trials. That is a governance function. December 2021, UN Security Council briefing, Martin Griffith. The phrase, quote, we rely on the necessary security guarantees by all relevant parties, end quote. Neutral phrasing. HTS is now a required security partner for cross-line aid. The language has shifted from prescription to coordination. October 2023, Security Council Report, Monthly Forecast. The phrase, quote, a letter to the Humanitarian Action Coordination, a humanitarian wing of the Syrian Salvation Government, end quote. The administrative apparatus is now treated as a bureaucratic counterpart. This is recognition in practice, conducted through routine institutional correspondence. January 2025, Security Council Report, Syria Monthly Forecast. The phrase, quote, while actors with territorial control and governance responsibility maintain influence across the country, end quote. HTS is no longer named directly. It is framed as an actor with governance responsibilities. The language has completed its migration from threat to partner. And from the same document, the phrase, quote, the Council could invite Syrian representatives to discuss how to adapt the political process to the new realities on the ground, end quote. HTS leadership is now treated as standard, quote, Syrian representatives in a political transition. The discursive work is done. Recognition appears natural. There are 4 implications. First, discursive categorization can precede and produce political legitimacy. Second, humanitarian coordination unintentionally restructures political landscapes. Third, neutral language is not neutral. It assigns governance responsibilities. And fourth, legitimacy can consolidate before elections, moderation, or reform. This is not confined to Syria. In the Sahel, Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, humanitarian actors increasingly treat jihadist-aligned governance structures as, quote, local authorities for access negotiations. In northwest Nigeria, the Civilian Joint Task Force is drifting from militia to community governance partner. In Sudan, RSF administrative control along aid routes is framed as, quote, local coordination bodies despite ongoing atrocities. The paradox is visible. It is replicating. Similar patterns are emerging elsewhere. In Afghanistan, Taliban technical ministries are normalized as bureaucratic interlocutors for aid access and service delivery. In Yemen, de facto Houthi governance is increasingly framed in administrative, not ideological, terms in UN OCHA reporting. In Gaza, growing references to civilian governance functions and humanitarian coordination mark early-stage civilianization. These are not predictions, they are observations. The same discursive dynamics are underway. This thesis offers 3 contributions. First, it identifies the Legitimacy-Access paradox as a recurring structural tension. International crisis response contains this dynamic. Humanitarian actors must engage local authorities to reach populations in need, yet that engagement simultaneously produces political legitimacy for those same actors. By naming this dynamic, the thesis provides a conceptual tool that captures a phenomenon long observed but never adequately theorized. Second, the thesis reframes legitimacy as a discursive process. Existing scholarship treats legitimacy as something earned through moderation, elections, or behavioral transformation. This thesis shows instead that legitimacy can be generated discursively through the authorized language humanitarian institutions use to justify coordination, describe actors, and document access. Legitimacy is not merely recognized, it is spoken into existence. Third, the thesis carries policy and counterterrorism implications. Discourse-driven legitimacy formation is not confined to Syria. Because humanitarian access relies on neutral, functional language, international institutions can inadvertently normalize actors still designated as terrorist organizations. This creates a growing gap between counterterrorism frameworks and operational realities, with significant implications for policy coherence, sanctions regimes, and future peace negotiations. This thesis lays the foundation for a broader research agenda. Cross-regional analysis of legitimacy access dynamics across the Sahel, Sudan, Afghanistan, Yemen, and the DRC, corpus-based methods for tracking discursive shift over time, and comparative theory building on how humanitarian language produces political authority. This is the beginning of a research program, not its end. Understanding how language produces legitimacy is essential for navigating humanitarian aid and international development in fragile and post-conflict states. The legitimacy access paradox isn't a case-specific anomaly. It's a structural feature of humanitarian governance, revealing how discourse quietly reshapes political realities. The words we use, the words we choose, don't just describe political realities. They create them. Thank you.